In the darkest corner of a high-kill shelter, a scarred German shepherd's tears went unnoticed for 847 days. Until a mysterious midnight phone call changed everything. What happened next shocked everyone. Even the veteran shelter staff couldn't believe their eyes. The fluorescent lights flickered and dimmed in the concrete corridors of Mountain View Animal Shelter, casting eerie shadows across the cold metal cages. In the last kennel of Row D, beneath the harsh glow of a dying bulb, lay Shadow, a once majestic German shepherd whose spirit seemed as broken as his past. His dark coat, now dulled and patchy, bore the visible scars of battles no one understood, while his amber eyes held secrets too painful to speak. Tonight was different from the 846 nights that came before. The usual cacophony of barks and whimpers that filled the shelter had fallen to a hushed whisper, as if every soul within these walls knew what tomorrow would bring. Shadow hadn't moved from his corner in days, his large frame pressed against the back wall, his head resting on paws that once carried him through happier times. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Now back to the story. "I'm sorry, big guy," whispered Mark, the night supervisor, as he made his final rounds. His weathered face reflected the weight of tomorrow's scheduled euthanasia. "We tried everything." His voice cracked slightly as he remembered the countless social media posts, the dozens of rescue organizations contacted, and the hundreds of visitors who had passed by Shadow's cage without a second glance. Shadow didn't even lift his head. At Mark's words, he had stopped responding to human voices weeks ago when he finally understood that no amount of tail wagging or gentle eyes would change his fate. The only sign that he was still alive was the steady rise and fall of his chest and the occasional tear that rolled down his muzzle, a sight so heartbreaking that even the most hardened shelter workers couldn't bear to watch. Mark lingered longer than usual at Shadow's cage, his fingers gripping the clipboard that held tomorrow's schedule. The German shepherd's file was thick with notes. "Found wandering Highway 23, severely injured, shows signs of past abuse, fearful but not aggressive, multiple failed adoption attempts," and finally, the words that had sealed his fate: "Unadoptable. Recommend humane euthanasia." But these clinical phrases couldn't capture the whole story. They couldn't tell of the nights when Shadow's quiet whimpers echoed through the shelter, or of the rare moments when a kind word would make his tail thump softly against the concrete floor. They couldn't explain why this particular dog, among the hundreds that had passed through these doors, had touched so many hearts, yet remained unclaimed. As Mark turned to leave, Shadow finally stirred. He lifted his head slightly, and for a brief moment their eyes met. In that gaze was something that would haunt Mark for years to come. Not fear, not anger, but a profound understanding that seemed to say, "I know, and it's okay." A single tear rolled down the dog's face, catching the dim light before disappearing into his dark fur. The sound of Mark's footsteps faded down the corridor, and Shadow returned to his vigil. Outside his small window, the moon cast a gentle glow across the shelter yard, where tomorrow would bring either an end or a beginning. But for now, in the quiet hours of this last night, Shadow waited, unaware that destiny was about to take an extraordinary turn, and that somewhere in the darkness, a phone was about to ring. Across town, in a modest apartment overlooking the city lights, Dr. Sarah Martinez sat at her desk, her veterinary scrub still on from her evening shift at the emergency animal hospital. Her computer screen cast a soft blue glow across her tired face as she scrolled mindlessly through her social media feed, trying to unwind from another emotionally draining day of helping injured and sick animals. The clock on her wall ticked. Past midnight, each second bringing Shadow closer to his scheduled fate, though Sarah didn't know about him yet. She was about to close her laptop and head to bed when a post caught her eye. A last desperate plea from Mountain View Animal Shelter, shared by one of her colleagues. Urgent, Shadow, German Shepherd, last chance. After 847 days, time has run out. Scheduled for tomorrow morning, staff favorite gentle soul despite his scars. Failed by humans too many times. Please don't let his story end here. The post included a photo that made Sarah's breath catch in her throat. Unlike the typical shelter photos that tried to capture happy moments or playful poses, this one showed raw truth, a magnificent German shepherd, his dark coat bearing the marks of a troubled past, lying in his kennel with tears, staining his fur. But it was his eyes that held Sarah transfixed, eyes that seemed to carry the weight of countless disappointments, yet still held a glimmer of something pure and unbroken. Sarah's hands trembled as she reached for her phone. She had sworn never to take on another rescue case after losing her beloved German Shepherd Max to cancer 6 months ago. The pain was still too fresh. The empty dog bed in the corner of her living room, a constant reminder of her loss. Her colleagues at the hospital had been gently suggesting she was ready to open her heart again, but she had always brushed them off. Yet something about Shadow's story, about those eyes, wouldn't let her scroll past. Perhaps it was the mention of 847 days, nearly 2.5 years of waiting. Or maybe it was the tears that reminded her so much of Max's final days, when her strong, brave companion had finally shown his vulnerability. "You can't save them all," she whispered to herself, the familiar mantra of veterinary professionals everywhere. But even as the words left her lips, she knew she had already made her decision. With shaking fingers, she dialed the shelter's after-hours emergency line. Each ring echoed in her quiet apartment, mixing with the sound of her pounding heart. Just as she was about to hang up, thinking no one would answer at this hour, a gruff voice came through. "Mountain View Shelter, Mark speaking." Sarah took a deep breath, her voice stronger than she expected. "Hi, my name is Dr. Sarah Martinez. I'm calling about Shadow, the German Shepherd scheduled for tomorrow morning." There was a long pause on the other end, followed by a tired sigh. "Doctor, I appreciate your concern, but we've been down this road before. Shadow's case is complicated." "I'm a veterinarian at City Emergency Animal Hospital," Sarah pressed on, her professional instincts kicking in. "I have experience with traumatized dogs, and I've worked with German Shepherds all my life. Please, just give me a chance to meet him." Another pause, longer this time. Sarah could hear the shuffle of papers, the sound of Mark considering her words. Finally, his voice returned, softer now. "The procedure is scheduled for 8 a.m. If you're serious about this, you need to be here when we open at 7. "I'll be there," Sarah promised, her heart racing. "Please, just don't give up on him yet." As she hung up the phone, Sarah caught her reflection in the window, the determination in her eyes mixing with fear and uncertainty. Was she ready for this? Could she handle another heartbreak if things went wrong? Outside, a gentle rain began to fall, and somewhere across the city, in his dark kennel, Shadow shifted in his sleep, unaware that tomorrow would bring something different than the end he expected. The pre-dawn hours at Mountain View Animal Shelter were usually quiet, but this morning carried a different kind of silence. The early February air bit cold and sharp as Mark unlocked the front doors, his breath forming small clouds in the darkness. It was 6:45 a.m., 15 minutes before their official opening time, when he spotted the black SUV already parked in the lot. Dr. Sarah Martinez sat in her vehicle, gripping her steering wheel, watching the shelter entrance through windows still, spotted with night rain. She hadn't slept at all after making the call, spending hours instead reading and rereading Shadow's online file, studying every comment, every note, every failed adoption attempt. The more she learned, the more questions she had. Found near. Highway 23 with severe injuries. multiple surgeries required, suspected fighting dog or abuse case. The clinical language couldn't hide the horror of what Shadow had endured. But it was the later notes that truly caught her attention. Shows remarkable gentleness despite trauma. Uzi protective of smaller dogs. Responds well to female staff members. Becomes withdrawn after adoption attempts fail. Mark noticed her professional demeanor as she stepped out of her car, medical ID badge still clipped to her jacket from yesterday's shift. Her dark hair was pulled back in a neat ponytail, and she carried herself with the quiet confidence of someone used to handling crisis situations. Yet he could see the shadows under her eyes, the slight tremor in her hands. That spoke of a sleepless night. "Dr. Martinez," he called out, holding the door open. "You're early." Sarah managed a small smile. "Couldn't sleep," she admitted, following him inside. The shelter's familiar sounds and smells washed over her. Disinfectant, kibble, the early morning chorus of dogs beginning to stir. But today, these familiar sensations carried a weight she'd never felt before. As they walked down the corridor toward Row D, Mark filled her in on Shadow's routine. He doesn't eat much in the mornings, prefers his food late at night when it's quiet, doesn't bark anymore, hasn't for months. And he's... Mark hesitated, choosing his words carefully. He's been crying more lately. Not whining or whimpering. Actual tears. The vet checked him out, found nothing physically wrong. It's like he knows. They reached Shadow's kennel, and Sarah's heart clenched. The proud German shepherd lay exactly as he had in the photo, pressed against the back wall, his scarred face turned away from the front of the cage. But as they approached, something unexpected happened. Shadow's ear twitched, and slowly, very slowly, he turned his head toward them. "That's unusual," Mark whispered, genuinely surprised. "He hasn't responded to visitors in weeks." Sarah knelt down, maintaining a respectful distance from the kennel door. Her veterinary training told her to be cautious, to watch for signs of fear or aggression, but something else, something that went beyond professional knowledge, told her to trust her instincts. "Hello, Shadow," she said softly, her voice carrying the same gentle tone she had used with Max during his final days. "I'm Sarah. I know you're tired, boy. I know you've been here for so long." Shadow's eyes met hers, and in that moment something passed between them, a flash of recognition, of shared pain and loneliness. A single tear rolled down his muzzle, but this time there was something different in his gaze. The resignation that Mark had seen the night before was replaced by a tiny spark of, what? Hope? Interest? Life? Sarah turned to Mark, her decision made. "I need to see his full medical history, and I want to sit with him for a while. Can we move somewhere quieter?" She paused, glancing at her watch. 7:15 a.m. "And Mark, please, cancel the procedure." As Mark hurried off to handle the paperwork, Sarah settled onto the floor near Shadow's kennel, pulling out her phone to cancel her morning appointments. She had no idea if this would work, if she could help heal Shadow's deep wounds, or if she was setting herself up for another heartbreak. But as she sat there in the early morning quiet, Shadow did something that made her breath catch. He moved ever so slightly toward the front of his cage, and for the first time in months, his tail twitched, the smallest movement. But in the growing light of dawn, it felt like the beginning of something extraordinary. In the shelter's small administrative office, Sarah sat at a worn desk, poring over Shadow's thick file. Mark had provided her with every document, every note, every scrap of information they had collected over the past 847 days. The morning light filtered through dusty blinds, casting striped shadows across papers that told a story of both tragedy and resilience. "His initial medical assessment," Mark explained, pointing to a stack of veterinary reports. It's Not easy reading, Doctor. Sarah's professional composure wavered as she examined the photographs from Shadow's intake. The X-rays showed old fractures that had healed poorly. Ribs, left hind leg, 2 toes. The skin conditions, the malnutrition, the defensive wounds. Each image told part of a story she'd seen too many times in her emergency room, but rarely this severe. He was found during a thunderstorm, Mark continued, his voice soft. Highway patrol spotted him limping along Route 23. Took 4 officers to gain his trust enough to get him into their car. He was terrified, but even then, Mark's voice caught slightly, even then he never showed aggression, just fear. Sarah nodded, noting the dates, the progression of treatments, the small victories and setbacks documented in clinical shorthand. But it was the behavioral notes that truly caught her attention. Between the lines of professional observations, she found glimpses of the dog beneath the trauma. Day 47, Shadow placed himself between staff member and an aggressive dog during yard time. Protective stance but no aggression. Day 156, first tail wag observed when aide Jessica brought him extra blanket during storm. Day 284, allowed physical examination without sedation, responded well to gentle voice commands. But then came the harder entries. Day 365, potential. Adoption failed. Shadow showed extreme anxiety when male adopter raised voice. Day 472, second adoption attempt unsuccessful. Shadow refused to leave shelter premises. Day 663, growing concerns about long-term confinement effects. Shadow, increasingly withdrawn. As Sarah read, she felt a presence behind her. Shadow's kennel attendant, a young woman named Maya, stood in the doorway. He used to be different, Maya said quietly. When I first started here, he would watch everything, like he was studying. Us all. He had this way of tilting his head when you talked to him, like he understood every word. But lately, she trailed off, her eyes glistening. Sarah turned to the most recent evaluations, her heart heavy. The decline was clear in the clinical data: decreased appetite, minimal interaction, increased episodes of crying. But there was something else, something that didn't quite fit the pattern of a dog who had given up. These tears, Sarah mused, more to herself than the others. In all my years of practice, I've never seen anything quite like this. It's almost as if... She was interrupted by a commotion from the kennel area. The sound of excited barking echoed down the hallway, followed by a crash. Mark jumped up, but Maya was already running toward the noise. "It's okay," Maya called back. "Mrs. Chen dropped her food bin during morning feeding, but..." Her voice took on a note of surprise. "You might want to come see this." Sarah followed Mark to Shadow's kennel, and what she saw made her stop in her tracks. Shadow was actually standing at the front of his cage. His ears were perked forward, his body tense but alert. A few pieces of scattered kibble had skittered near his kennel, but he wasn't looking at the food. He was looking directly at Sarah, and as their eyes met again, she saw something that hadn't been there before. A question. In all the medical reports, all the behavioral assessments, no one had mentioned this: the intelligence, the awareness, the spark of something deeper behind those amber eyes. Sarah pulled out her phone and quickly dialed her clinic. "Claire, it's Dr. Martinez. I'm going to need to clear my schedule for the next few days." "Yes, all of it. And can you pull everything we have on trauma recovery and abuse cases? I think..." She paused, watching as Shadow took a small step closer to the kennel door. "I think we're about to try something new." Mark and Maya exchanged glances, hope warring with caution in their expressions. They had seen too many failed attempts, too many disappointed faces, but something was different this time. Something in the way Shadow responded to Sarah, in the way he had literally risen from his corner of despair, suggested that maybe, just maybe, this time would be different. As if to confirm their hopes, Shadow did something he hadn't done in months. He lowered his head and gently nudged his water bowl, not to drink, but as if he was showing them he still knew how to interact with his world. The small action brought tears to Maya's eyes. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Sarah felt it too, the weight of this moment, the responsibility of the choice she was making. But as she watched Shadow's subtle signs of reawakening, she knew there was no turning back. Whatever shadows lurked in this dog's past, whatever challenges lay ahead, she was committed to helping him find his way back to the light. Chapter 5 First Steps, 1230. The process of adopting a dog from Mountain View Animal Shelter usually involved mountains of paperwork, home visits, and careful evaluation. But given Sarah's professional background and Shadow's urgent situation, Mark was expediting everything he could. Still, there were protocols that couldn't be rushed, especially for a case as complex as Shadow's. "We need to do an interaction test," Mark explained, leading Sarah to the shelter's assessment room. It was a simple space, neutral-colored walls, a few chairs, and a large window allowing staff to observe from outside. Given his history, "We have to be certain." Sarah nodded, understanding the unspoken concern. Despite her credentials, despite Shadow's apparent response to her, they needed to see how he would react in a more intimate setting. The room itself was designed to minimize stress. Soft lighting, sound-dampening walls, and enough space for a dog to retreat if feeling overwhelmed. Maya appeared with Shadow on a lead, and Sarah's heart tightened. In the broader space of the assessment room, his deteriorated condition was even more apparent. His once powerful frame had grown lean from stress and minimal appetite, and his movements were hesitant, uncertain. Yet there was still something regal in his bearing, a ghost of the magnificent dog he must have been before tragedy struck. "I'll handle him," Maya said softly, but Shadow surprised them all by taking a few steps towards Sarah, his nose twitching slightly as he caught her scent. Sarah remained seated, making herself smaller, less threatening. She didn't reach out or call to him. Instead, she waited, letting Shadow set the pace. Her years of veterinary experience had taught her that sometimes the most powerful thing you could do was nothing at all. Minutes ticked by in silence. Shadow stood in the center of the room, his eyes moving between Sarah and the door. His tail hung low, but the tip occasionally twitched, a subtle sign that he was engaged rather than shutting down. Then, slowly, he began to circle the room, his nose working overtime as he processed this new environment and the woman within it. On his third circuit, Shadow paused near Sarah's chair. Everyone watching through the window held their breath. With painstaking slowness, Shadow lowered his head and sniffed Sarah's shoes, then her pant leg. His body remained tense, ready to retreat, but something kept him there. Sarah felt tears welling in her eyes as she recognized the behavior. Max had done the same thing when she first met him as a puppy, that careful investigation that said, "I want to trust you, but I need to be sure." Keeping her movements slow and telegraphed, she turned her palm upward on her knee, offering but not reaching. Shadow's ears twitched at her movement, but he didn't back away. Instead, he stretched his neck forward slightly, his nose hovering inches from her hand. His breath was warm against her skin as he scented her thoroughly, processing information in ways humans could only imagine. Then it happened. A moment so subtle it could have been missed if not for the absolute silence in the room. Shadow's tongue, pink and hesitant, darted out and touched Sarah's palm. It was the briefest of contacts, gone almost before it began, but its significance was enormous. Through the window, Maya gasped softly, and Mark muttered something that sounded like a prayer. They had seen countless interactions in this room, but none quite like this. Shadow hadn't just tolerated Sarah's presence. He had chosen to initiate contact. The German shepherd backed away after his brave gesture, returning to Maya's side, but his eyes remained on Sarah. The fear was still there, the trauma still evident in every line of his body, but now there was something else too. A glimmer of what might have been trust, or at least the possibility of it. Sarah wiped her eyes, her professional demeanor cracking slightly. "How soon can I take him home?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Mark stepped into the room, moving carefully to avoid startling Shadow. "We can start the paperwork now, but—" He hesitated, choosing his words carefully. "Dr. Martinez, you need to understand. Shadow's never made it past the front door in his previous adoption attempts. Even getting him to your car might be." "No, then we'll take it one step at a time," Sarah interrupted gently, her eyes never leaving Shadow. "If it takes all day, if it takes a week, we'll move at his pace." Maya nodded approvingly, her free hand absently wiping tears from her cheeks. Shadow remained where he was, but his tail had begun a slow, rhythmic movement, not quite a wag, but something more than the lifeless hanging of before. As Mark left to begin processing the adoption papers, Sarah settled in for what she knew might be a long wait. She had cleared her schedule, prepared her home, and made peace with her decision. Now came the hardest part, proving to a dog who had lost faith in tomorrow that some humans were worth trusting again. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the shelter's front lobby, as Sarah sat cross-legged on the floor, a few feet from where Shadow stood frozen in the doorway. They had spent the past 3 hours moving inch by inch from the assessment room, through the corridors, and finally to this threshold, the boundary that had defeated every previous adoption attempt. "He's never made it this far before," Maya whispered from where she stood with Mark near the front desk. The young kennel attendant had stayed well past the end of her shift, unwilling to miss this moment. Usually, he starts panicking as soon as he sees the front doors. Sarah kept her attention focused on Shadow, whose entire body trembled as he stared at the glass doors leading to the outside world. His ears swiveled constantly, tracking every sound, and his tail was tucked tight against his body. But he hadn't retreated, not yet. "It's okay, sweet boy," Sarah murmured, keeping her voice soft and steady. "We have all the time in the world." She had prepared for this, laying a trail of high-value treats, small pieces of cooked chicken, and tiny dots of peanut butter from the interior hallway to the lobby. Shadow had followed the trail hesitantly, stopping frequently to assess his surroundings, but the familiar shelter scents and the presence of shelter staff had helped him maintain his composure. Now, however, they faced the greatest challenge. Through those glass doors lay a world Shadow hadn't seen in nearly 2.5 years. A world that had hurt him so badly he'd rather face death than step back into it. Sarah reached into her pocket and withdrew something she'd brought from home, a soft piece of fabric that still carried Max's scent. She had saved some of his things after he passed, unable to part with them, and now she was grateful for that sentiment. Carefully, she placed the fabric on the floor between herself and Shadow. The German shepherd's nose twitched as he caught the new scent. His ears perked forward slightly, and despite his fear, curiosity drew him a half-step closer. Something about the smell of another German shepherd, one who had known nothing but love and safety, seemed to call to him. "That's it," Sarah encouraged, her voice barely above a whisper. "You're so brave, Shadow. So very brave." Mark returned from his office with a set of papers in his hands. "The adoption is official," he said quietly, placing the documents on the front desk. "He's yours now, Dr. Martinez, if we can get him to go with you." Shadow startled at Mark's voice, taking a quick step backward, but then something remarkable happened. Instead of retreating all the way back to his kennel as he had in previous attempts, he looked at Sarah. In that gaze was a question, a plea, a struggle between terror and trust. Sarah remained still, projecting calm despite the emotion threatening to overwhelm her. "I know you're scared," she told him softly. "I'm a little scared too, but we can be scared together, okay?" As if understanding her words, Shadow took one small step forward, then another. His nose touched the fabric that carried Max's scent, and he inhaled deeply. When he lifted his head again, something had changed in his eyes, a tiny spark of courage pushing through the fear. Maya, who had been holding her breath, let out a quiet sob. "Come on, Shadow," she whispered. "You can do this." The next few minutes unfolded like a delicate dance. Shadow would advance a few steps, freeze, retreat slightly, then gather his courage and move forward again. Sarah remained his anchor point, steady and patient, offering soft words of encouragement, but never pushing. Finally, after what seemed like hours, Shadow stood directly beside Sarah, his body still trembling but his head held just a fraction higher. Together, they faced the glass doors and the world beyond, a world that had shown Shadow its cruelest face, but might now, through Sarah, offer him a chance at redemption. "Ready to go home?" Sarah asked quietly, slowly rising to her feet. Shadow pressed against her leg, not from affection, but from the instinctive need to stay close to the one thing that felt safe in this moment of overwhelming change. As Maya held the door open, letting in a breath of fresh air, Shadow took his first step toward freedom. Not with confidence, not with joy, but with something perhaps more valuable: hope. Getting Shadow from the shelter's front door to Sarah's SUV proved to be another monumental challenge. The vehicle sat just 30 feet away, but to a dog who hadn't been outside in 847 days, it might as well have been miles. The February wind rustled through bare trees, carrying unfamiliar scents that made Shadow's ears twitch constantly. Sarah had purposely parked in the quietest corner of the lot, away from the main road. She'd also laid out a thick blanket on the back seat and sprayed it with a calming pheromone spray, small preparations that she hoped would make a difference. Now, as she stood beside Shadow in the parking lot, she was grateful for every precaution. "The car is giving him pause," Mark observed quietly from the shelter doorway. He and Maya watched anxiously as Shadow processed this new challenge. The German Shepherd's paws seemed rooted to the concrete, his eyes darting between the vehicle and the shelter door behind him. Sarah kept a loose hold on Shadow's leash, knowing that tension would only increase his anxiety. "It's okay," she murmured, kneeling beside him. "We'll take it one step at a time, just like before." She reached into her pocket and pulled out another piece of the fabric that carried Max's scent, along with a few pieces of chicken. Shadow's nose twitched, but he remained frozen. The sounds of distant traffic, the cry of a bird overhead, the rustle of leaves, each new stimulus seemed to press against him like a physical weight. Then, somewhere in the distance, a car backfired. Shadow's reaction was immediate and heartbreaking. He dropped to the ground, his body flattening against the pavement, a high-pitched whine escaping his throat. His eyes grew wild with panic, and for a moment Sarah feared he would bolt. But instead of running, Shadow did something unexpected. He pressed against Sarah's legs, seeking protection from the very person he barely knew. It was an instinctive action, born of terror rather than trust, but it gave Sarah an idea. "Maya," she called softly, "could you bring out one of his blankets from the shelter? The one from his kennel?" Maya disappeared inside and returned moments later with a worn blue blanket that carried Shadow's familiar scent. Sarah took it gratefully and, moving slowly, draped it over Shadow's trembling form. Under the familiar covering, his breathing began to steady. That's it, Sarah encouraged, keeping her voice low and calm. You're safe, Shadow. Nothing bad is going to happen. She began humming softly, a habit she'd developed with Max during thunderstorms, and gradually Shadow's trembling subsided. When she felt him relax slightly, Sarah began her next move. Still humming, she shifted her position inch by inch toward the car, letting the blanket trail behind her like a security bridge between Shadow's past and future. To everyone's amazement, Shadow followed, keeping himself partially covered by the blanket as he moved. It took nearly 45 minutes to reach the car. Shadow stopped countless times, retreating several steps before gathering his courage to move forward again. But finally, they stood beside the open back door, where the scent of the pheromone spray mixed with the lingering essence of Max on the blanket Sarah had placed there earlier. "Almost there," Sarah whispered, her legs cramping from moving so. "Slowly, just one more step, brave boy." Shadow stretched his neck forward, sniffing the car's interior thoroughly. His body remained tense, ready to flee, but something about the familiar smells seemed to calm him. After several long moments, he placed one paw on the back seat, then another. Maya, who had been watching silently, let out a quiet cheer. Mark smiled, shaking his head in amazement. "I never thought I'd see the day," he admitted, his voice thick with emotion. With painful slowness, Shadow pulled himself fully into the vehicle, immediately pressing himself against the far door. He was still trembling, still terrified, but he had done it. He had left the shelter not just in body, but in spirit, choosing to face his fears rather than remain in his safe but solitary world. Sarah carefully closed the car door, her own hands shaking from the emotional intensity of the past hour. She turned to Mark and Maya, who stood watching with tears in their eyes. "Thank you," she said simply, knowing no words could fully express her gratitude for their patience and support. "Take care of our boy," Maya replied, wiping her eyes. "And please let us know how he's doing." Sarah nodded, then slowly made her way to the driver's seat. As she settled behind the wheel, she glanced in the rearview mirror. Shadow lay curled tightly in the back, still partially covered by his shelter blanket, his eyes fixed on her reflection. "Okay, Shadow," she said softly, starting the engine with trembling fingers. "Let's go home." As they pulled away from Mountain View Animal Shelter, Sarah caught one last glimpse of Mark and Maya standing in the doorway. They had believed in Shadow when no one else would, kept him alive long enough for this chance. Now it was her turn to help him discover that life could be more than survival. It could be a journey back to joy. The drive to Sarah's home normally took 15 minutes, but today she chose a longer route, avoiding main roads and construction zones. Her eyes constantly darted to the rearview mirror, checking on Shadow. The German Shepherd remained pressed against the door, his body tense, but his eyes never left her reflection. "We're almost there," Sarah said softly, more to fill the silence than anything else. She had turned the radio off, knowing that unexpected sounds could trigger Shadow's anxiety. The only noise was the gentle hum of the engine and Shadow's slightly rapid breathing. At each stoplight, Sarah held her breath, worried that passing cars or pedestrians might startle him. But Shadow seemed to have retreated into himself, as if he'd built an invisible wall between himself and the overwhelming outside world. His focus on Sarah's reflection appeared to be his only anchor to reality. When they finally pulled into the driveway of her modest suburban home, Sarah felt a mix of relief and apprehension. The next challenge would be getting Shadow from the car into the house, another threshold, another test of his fragile trust. "Home, sweet home," she murmured, turning off the engine. The house was set back from the street, with a fenced backyard that had once been Max's kingdom. Sarah had spent the previous night preparing everything, setting up a new bed in a quiet corner, securing potentially frightening items like the vacuum cleaner, and creating what she hoped would be a safe space. For Shadow to begin his healing, she opened her door slowly, telegraphing every movement. Shadow's ears twitched at the sound, but he remained still. Moving to the back door, Sarah took a deep breath before opening it with the same careful deliberation. Shadow didn't move. His eyes had grown wide again, darting between Sarah and the unfamiliar house before them. The shelter blanket still draped partially over his body, and he seemed to press himself further into it. "It's okay," Sarah assured him, keeping her voice steady despite her concern. "We have all the time you need." Minutes ticked by. The February sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the driveway. Sarah's legs grew tired from standing, but she didn't move, didn't rush. She had learned from their experience at the shelter that patience was their greatest ally. Finally, after nearly 20 minutes, Shadow shifted slightly. His nose worked overtime, processing the sense of his new environment. Sarah noticed his attention fix on something: the garden bed near the front door, where Max had loved to dig despite her constant scolding. Even after months, it probably still carried his scent. Slowly, so slowly it was almost imperceptible, Shadow began to move toward the car door. His whole body trembled with the effort, but something about Max's lingering presence seemed to draw him forward. When his paws finally touched the driveway, Sarah had to bite her lip to keep from crying out in triumph. But they weren't done yet. The front door seemed to loom before them, another barrier between Shadow and whatever lay ahead. Sarah kept the leash loose, letting him process this new challenge at his own pace. She had deliberately left the porch, light off, knowing that harsh illumination might make him more anxious. Shadow's progress toward the house was painfully slow. Every few steps he would freeze, his ears swiveling to catch some distant sound. The shelter blanket dragged behind him like a security cape, and Sarah didn't dare suggest removing it. Whatever gave him comfort, she would accept. As they approached the front door, Sarah noticed something that made her heart skip. Shadow's nose was working frantically, but his tail, which had been tucked tight against his body since leaving the shelter, had lifted slightly. Not wagging, not even close, but no longer pressed against him in absolute terror. Sarah unlocked the door with trembling fingers, pushing it open to reveal the dimly lit interior. She had left several nightlights on, creating gentle pools of illumination that wouldn't overwhelm him. The new bed was visible from the entrance, positioned so he could see most of the living room while feeling secure against the wall. Shadow stood at the threshold, his body rigid with tension. But this time, something was different. Instead of freezing in absolute terror, he began to investigate, his nose twitching as he processed the sense of his new environment. Sarah recognized the behavior. He was creating a mental map of this strange new territory, cataloging every smell, every shadow. Then, in a moment that brought tears to Sarah's eyes, Shadow took a deliberate step forward. Then another, and another. Each movement was careful, considered, but they were his choice. No coaxing, no treats needed. When his whole body was finally inside, Sarah quietly closed the door behind them, sealing them into their new shared reality. Shadow stood in the center of the living room, still trembling slightly but standing, surveying. His eyes moved from corner to corner, noting exits, shadows, potential threats. But they always returned to Sarah, as if checking that she was still there, still his anchor in this sea of uncertainty. "Welcome home, Shadow," Sarah whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "Welcome home." The first hours in a new home are always crucial for a rescue dog, but for Shadow, they were nothing short of monumental. Sarah sat quietly on the floor, her back against the couch, watching as the German Shepherd conducted his painstaking exploration of the living room. He moved with the caution of a bomb disposal expert, each step calculated, each movement precise. The shelter blanket remained draped over his back, trailing behind him like a security blanket as he investigated his new surroundings. His nose worked constantly, processing layers of information that Sarah could only imagine: the lingering scent of Max in the fabric of the furniture, the fresh pine scent of the cleaning products she'd used, the history of this place told in molecules, and memories. "Everything here is safe," Sarah murmured softly, maintaining a running commentary that seemed to help Shadow stay grounded. "That's your new bed in the corner. The kitchen's through there, but we don't need to explore that yet. Take your time. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you're enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Shadow's methodical investigation paused at Max's old toy box, tucked discreetly in a corner. Sarah had debated removing it, but something had told her to leave it. Now, as Shadow's nose twitched at the weathered wooden box, she saw his ears perk forward with interest for the first time since entering the house. Inside the box lay Max's collection of well-loved toys: tennis balls worn smooth, rope toys frayed from countless tugging games, and a particular stuffed duck that had been his constant companion. Shadow stretched his neck forward, taking in the sense of a happy dog's life, and something in his posture shifted ever so slightly. The clock on the wall ticked past 7 p.m., and Sarah realized they would need to establish some kind of routine. In the shelter, Shadow had been fed at regular times, and maintaining that schedule might help him feel more secure. She had already prepared his dinner, the same brand of food he'd eaten at the shelter, measured precisely to match his usual portion. "I'm going to get your dinner ready," she announced quietly, keeping her voice steady. "Would that be okay?" Shadow's head snapped up at her movement, his body tensing. The slight relaxation he'd shown near the toy box vanished, replaced by the now familiar anxiety. But he didn't retreat to a corner or show signs of panic. Instead, his eyes tracked her movement toward the kitchen, his ears swiveling to follow every sound. Sarah moved slowly, narrating her actions. "Just going to the kitchen, getting your bowl, measuring your food." The commentary seemed to help, giving Shadow a way to track her movements without visual contact. She could hear his breathing pattern change as she moved around the kitchen, quickening when she was out of sight, steadying when her voice reached him. When she returned with his bowl, she noticed something remarkable. Shadow had moved slightly closer to the kitchen doorway, as if drawn by curiosity despite his fear. His shelter blanket had slipped partially off his back, and he hadn't immediately tried to huddle back under it. Sarah placed the bowl near his bed, then retreated to her spot by the couch. In the shelter, Shadow had preferred to eat late at night when everyone was gone. She prepared herself for a long wait, but to her surprise, Shadow began to inch toward the bowl almost immediately. His approach to the food was unlike anything Sarah had seen in her years of veterinary work. Instead of circling the bowl or sniffing it directly, Shadow maintained constant visual contact with her while sliding sideways toward his dinner. It was as if he'd developed this technique to minimize his vulnerability while eating, a behavior that spoke volumes about his past experiences. When he finally reached the bowl, Shadow did something that brought tears to Sarah's eyes. He looked directly at her, then at the food, then back at her, asking permission. In that moment, Sarah saw not just the trauma that had shaped him, but the intelligence and sensitivity that had helped him survive. "It's all yours, sweet boy," she whispered. "You're safe here." Shadow lowered his head and began to eat, taking small, careful bites. Every few seconds, he would pause and look up, checking Sarah's position, assessing his safety. But he ate, really ate, finishing the entire bowl for the first time in weeks, according to his shelter records. As the evening deepened into night, Sarah maintained her quiet vigil on the floor, her laptop balanced on her knees as she caught up on patient notes. Shadow had retreated to a spot halfway between his new bed and the wall, the shelter blanket once again arranged around him like a nest. But his eyes, which had been constantly moving since their arrival, had begun to show signs of fatigue. The first yawn caught them both by surprise. Shadow seemed startled by his own vulnerability, quickly scanning the room as if expecting punishment for showing weakness. But when no repercussion came, some of the tension seemed to leave his body. "It's okay to rest," Sarah told him softly. "I'll be right here." As if understanding her words, Shadow lowered his head to his paws. His eyes remained open, fixed on Sarah, but they began to blink slower and slower. The day's emotions, challenges, and victories had taken their toll on both of them. Sarah found herself yawning too, but she didn't move toward her bedroom. Tonight, she would sleep on the couch, unwilling to leave Shadow alone in this new environment. As she watched him fighting sleep, still trying to stay alert, still trying to be brave, she made him a silent promise. "One day," she thought, "you'll know what it means to sleep without fear, to play without looking over your shoulder, to love without wondering if it will hurt. One day, Shadow, you'll know what it means to be truly home." The digital clock on Sarah's DVD player blinked 2:17 a.m. when the first nightmare came. She had been dozing lightly on the couch, one hand dangling toward the floor to maintain some connection with Shadow, when she heard it. A sound unlike anything she'd heard before, somewhere between a whimper and a sob. Shadow was twitching in his sleep, his paws making small running motions against the hardwood floor. The shelter blanket had twisted around him like a straitjacket, and his breathing had become rapid and shallow. But it was the tears that broke Sarah's heart, actual tears rolling down his face as he fought whatever demons haunted his dreams. "Shadow," she called softly, not moving yet, knowing that startling him awake could be dangerous. "Shadow, you're safe. You're home now." His eyes snapped open, wild with terror, unseeing at first. His body coiled tight, ready to flee or fight, but something made him pause. Sarah's familiar scent, perhaps, or the gentle tone of her voice that had become his anchor throughout the day. Reality seemed to seep back into his awareness gradually. His eyes focused on Sarah, then darted around the room, reassembling the pieces of his new world. The tension in his body didn't completely disappear, but it shifted from panic to watchful anxiety. Sarah remained on the couch, maintaining their positions from earlier in the evening. "Just a dream," she soothed, keeping her voice low and steady. "Everything's okay." Shadow's breathing slowly returned to normal, but he made no attempt to go back to sleep. Instead, he pushed himself up into a sitting position, his ears moving constantly as he tracked every night sound, the hum of the refrigerator, the distant call of an owl, the soft tick of the heating system coming on. Sarah recognized the behavior from her years of emergency veterinary work. Some rescued dogs, especially those with severe trauma, developed hypervigilance, a state of constant alertness that made real rest impossible. Shadow had probably been operating on micro-sleeps for months, never allowing himself to fall into deep, vulnerable slumber. Making a decision, Sarah slowly reached for her phone and pulled up a playlist she had created for anxious patients at her clinic. The soft, instrumental music began to play, just barely audible, creating a gentle barrier between Shadow and the unpredictable sounds of the night. At first, Shadow's ears twitched at the new sound, but as the steady, predictable rhythm continued, some of the tension seemed to leave his body. The music wasn't loud enough to mask potential threats. Sarah knew better than to make him feel vulnerable, but it provided a constant, soothing presence in the room. "I used to play this for Max during thunderstorms," she told Shadow quietly. He was brave about everything else, but thunder terrified him. Funny how every dog has their own fears, their own stories. Shadow's head tilted slightly at the mention of Max's name, a gesture so normal, so dog-like, that Sarah felt tears spring to her eyes. It was the first time he had shown this kind of natural response, free from the overlay of trauma that colored most of his reactions, Encouraged, Sarah continued talking, keeping her voice soft and melodic. She told Shadow about Max, his love of swimming, his habit of hiding tennis balls in the garden, his gentle way with the clinic's smallest patients. As she spoke, she noticed Shadow's sitting position gradually relaxing, his weight settling more naturally onto his haunches. The night deepened around them, but neither human nor dog seemed inclined to sleep. Instead, they found themselves in a quiet communion, broken occasionally by Sarah's gentle stories and the soft background music. Shadow's eyes remained open, but the frantic scanning had slowed, focusing more often on Sarah's face as she spoke. Around 4 a.m., something extraordinary happened. Shadow, who had maintained his distance all night, shifted position slightly. The movement was almost imperceptible, but Sarah noticed that he had angled himself to face her more directly. It wasn't a huge change, perhaps only an inch or two, but in the language of traumatized dogs, it spoke volumes. He wasn't ready to trust completely, wasn't ready to let down all his guards, but he had made a choice. Instead of watching the shadows for threats, he had chosen to watch her instead, to make her his reference point in this strange new world. As the first hint of dawn began to lighten the windows, Sarah saw Shadow's eyes finally beginning to droop. His head would lower, slightly, then jerk back up, fighting the exhaustion that was slowly overtaking his vigilance. The music played softly in the background, a lullaby for a dog who had forgotten how to rest. "Sleep," Sarah whispered, fighting her own exhaustion. "I'll keep watch. You can rest now." Perhaps it was the gentleness in her voice, or perhaps Shadow had simply reached the limit of his endurance, but slowly, gradually his head lowered to his paws. His eyes remained half open, fixed on Sarah, but their frantic movement had stilled. In the growing light of dawn, Sarah watched as Shadow finally surrendered to sleep. His breathing deepened and evened out, and for the first time since leaving the shelter, his face relaxed completely. There would be more nightmares, she knew, more battles to fight against the shadows of his past. But this moment, this small victory of trust over terror, felt like the first real step toward healing. The sun was well above the horizon when Sarah opened her eyes, momentarily disoriented by the crick in her neck from sleeping on the couch. The events of yesterday flooded back as she carefully sat up, her heart racing when she didn't immediately see Shadow in his spot by the wall. But her panic was short-lived. A slight movement caught her eye, and she found him sitting alertly by the sliding glass door that led to the backyard. The morning light illuminated his profile, and for the first time, Sarah could truly see the noble bearing that his fear had masked, the proud arch of his neck, the intelligent set of his ears, the natural dignity that even trauma couldn't fully erase. He had shed the shelter blanket during his move to the door, and Sarah noticed that his tail, while not wagging, lay in a more natural position. He was watching something in the backyard with intense focus, his head moving in small, precise movements. Following his gaze, Sarah spotted the source of his fascination, a pair of cardinals hopping along the fence, their bright red feathers vivid against the winter-bare branches. Shadow's attention was completely absorbed by their movements, and in his concentration, he seemed to have forgotten his fear, if only for a moment. "Good morning," Sarah said softly, keeping her voice low to avoid startling him. Shadow's head snapped around, the spell broken. For a second, she saw panic flash in his eyes as he remembered where he was, who she was, what had changed. But recovery came quicker this time. His body tensed, but didn't flee. His eyes found her face and held steady. Sarah moved slowly, as she stood, narrating her actions as she had yesterday. "I'm just going to get your breakfast ready. Would you like to see the kitchen properly now?" To her surprise, Shadow rose and followed her, maintaining a careful distance but showing genuine interest. The kitchen, with its morning light streaming through white curtains, felt less threatening than it had in last night's shadows. Shadow's nose worked overtime as he catalogued new scents. The coffee maker warming up, the bag of kibble in the corner, the lingering aroma of Sarah's dinner from the night before. As Sarah prepared his breakfast, measuring the kibble exactly, as the shelter had done, she noticed something different about Shadow's demeanor. While still cautious, his movements seemed more deliberate, less reactive. He was exploring, rather than just surviving, his natural intelligence beginning to emerge from beneath layers of fear. "Here you go," she said, placing his bowl in the same spot they'd used last night. But instead of backing away immediately, she stayed crouched nearby, testing a theory. Shadow approached the bowl with less hesitation than before, while he still did his characteristic side-stepping approach. His eyes stayed on the food rather than constantly checking Sarah's position. When he reached the bowl, he even turned his back to her slightly, a tiny gesture that spoke volumes about growing trust. As he ate, Sarah spoke quietly about their plans for the day. "I've taken the week off work to help you settle in. We don't have to do anything exciting, just get to know each other, learn the routine. Maybe later, if you're feeling brave, we could look at the backyard together." Shadow's ears twitched at her words, though he continued eating. His appetite seemed better this morning, his movements more fluid. The rigid tension that had gripped him yesterday had eased somewhat, replaced by a watchful but less panicked awareness. When he finished eating, Shadow did something that made Sarah's heart skip. Instead of immediately retreating to his safe spot by the wall, he stood for a moment, looking between Sarah and the sliding glass door. His body language was clear. He was curious about what lay beyond that glass barrier. "Would you like to see?" Sarah asked, keeping the excitement out of her voice despite the hope rising in her chest. She moved slowly to the door, Shadow tracking her movement with his eyes. The backyard was modest but well-maintained, surrounded by a solid wooden fence that Max had helped her pick out years ago. A large maple tree provided shade in one corner, and Sarah had maintained a small garden that was now dormant for winter. It wasn't much, but it was private, secure, and most importantly, safe. Sarah slid the door open just a few inches, letting the crisp morning air flow in. Shadow's nose immediately went into overdrive, processing the complex tapestry of outdoor scents. His ears moved constantly, cataloguing the sounds of birds, distant traffic, and rustling leaves. For several long minutes, they stood there together. Sarah by the door, Shadow a few feet back, both contemplating the world beyond. The cardinals had returned to the fence, joined now by a group of chickadees at the bird feeder. Shadow watched them with the same intense focus as before, his natural instincts warring with his learned fears. Then, in a moment that brought tears, to Sarah's eyes, Shadow took one small step toward the open door. His body trembled slightly, but his eyes were clear and focused. He wasn't running from something this time. He was choosing to move towards something, and the difference was profound. "Whenever you're ready," Sarah whispered, understanding that this moment, like every other in Shadow's journey, would unfold at its own pace. "The world is waiting for you, brave boy, and this time you're not facing it alone." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Shadow's first step onto the back patio was so careful, so deliberate, that it seemed to happen in slow motion. His paw touched the concrete as if testing not just its solidity, but the very concept of being outside by choice rather than necessity. The morning sun warmed his dark coat, and Sarah saw his muscles ripple with a mixture of tension and awakening awareness. The backyard lay before them, like an unexplored continent. To Sarah, it was a familiar space filled with memories of Max chasing squirrels and playing fetch. But through Shadow's eyes, she knew it must look vastly different, a complex landscape of potential threats and escape routes, of unfamiliar scents and uncertain terrain. "Easy does it," Sarah murmured, remaining in the doorway as Shadow ventured another step forward. She had left his leash on, letting it trail behind him like a safety line, but she didn't hold it. This needed to be his choice, his exploration. Shadow's investigation of the yard followed a precise pattern that spoke of both intelligence and hard-learned caution. He began with the perimeter, staying close to the house at first, his nose working constantly as he processed years of canine history recorded in scent molecules. Every few steps, he would freeze, ears swiveling to track a distant sound or movement. The birds that had so fascinated him from inside now drew his attention again. A blue jay landed on the fence, bold and noisy, causing Shadow to startle slightly. But instead of retreating in panic, he held his ground, watching the bird with that same intense focus Sarah had noticed earlier. "They used to drive Max crazy," Sarah said softly, maintaining the gentle narrative that seemed to help Shadow stay grounded. He'd spend hours watching them, though he never tried to chase them, just liked to keep track of their comings and goings. At the mention of Max's name, Shadow's ear twitched, and he turned to look at Sarah. There was something different in his gaze now, a questioning look that seemed more engaged, more present than the fearful vacancy she'd first seen at the shelter. He took another step into the yard, then another, gradually moving away from the safety of the house. Sarah's breath caught as she watched him approach the maple tree where Max's old rope swing still hung. The thick rope, weathered by seasons, but still sturdy, swayed slightly in the morning breeze. Shadow stretched his neck forward, nose twitching as he caught Max's lingering scent on the rope. Then something extraordinary happened. Shadow's tail, which had been hanging in a neutral position, gave a single, slight wag. It was barely more than a twitch, so brief that Sarah might have missed it if she hadn't been watching so intently. But it was there, a momentary expression of interest, perhaps even pleasure, breaking through the layers of trauma. The peaceful moment was shattered by the sudden roar of a motorcycle accelerating on the street, beyond the fence. Shadow's reaction was immediate. His body dropped low, hackles rising, a low growl rumbling in his throat. But unlike his previous panic responses, this was different. This was protective rather than fearful. He backed up quickly, positioning himself between Sarah and the direction of the noise. His eyes were alert, focused, his body tense, but not trembling. In that instant, Sarah saw a glimpse of who Shadow might have been before trauma changed him. A loyal, protective companion, brave despite his fears. "It's okay," Sarah assured him, touched by his instinctive move to protect her. "Just a motorcycle, though I'm not a fan of them either, if I'm honest." The sound faded, but Shadow remained vigilant, his attention now divided between watching the fence and checking on Sarah. His earlier relaxation had vanished, replaced by heightened awareness, but there was something almost purposeful about his alertness now. Sarah was about to suggest they head back inside when a new sound caught their attention, the distinct click of a camera shutter from somewhere beyond the fence. Shadow's ears shot forward, his body tensing again, and Sarah felt her own pulse quicken. Standing slowly, she moved to the edge of the patio, trying to catch a glimpse through the fence slats. For a brief moment, she thought she saw movement. A shadow retreating, the rustle of bushes, but when she looked again, there was nothing. Shadow, however, remained fixed on that spot, his posture conveying a certainty that made Sarah's skin prickle. Something about his reaction, the intensity of his focus, suggested this wasn't just random paranoia. He sensed something or someone, and his instincts had shifted from fear to vigilance. "Let's go inside," Sarah said quietly, unable to shake the uneasy feeling. Shadow didn't hesitate, turning immediately toward the house while maintaining his protective position between Sarah and the fence. As they stepped back into the safety of the house, Sarah couldn't help but wonder, had someone really been watching them, and if so, why? The questions nagged at her as she secured the door, but her immediate concern was for Shadow. His first brave steps into his new world had been interrupted, and she worried this might set back their progress. But when she looked at him, she saw something unexpected. Though alert and watchful, Shadow hadn't retreated to his corner or sought the shelter of his blanket. Instead, he stood firmly in the middle of the living room, his attention divided between the glass door and Sarah, as if he had appointed himself guardian of their shared space. In that moment, Sarah realized something profound. Shadow's trauma hadn't destroyed his capacity for courage. It had just buried it beneath layers of fear. And now, faced with a potential threat, not to himself, but to his new person, that courage was finding its way back to the surface. Sarah spent the afternoon making calls, first to her local police department to report the suspicious activity, then to Mark at the shelter to ask if anyone had shown unusual interest in Shadow recently. The police promised to increase patrols in the area, while Mark's response was more concerning. "Now that you mention it," he said, his voice troubled, "we did have someone come by the day before you adopted him. A man asking very specific questions about Shadow, wanted to know his exact location in the shelter, his daily routine, whether he was still scheduled for euthanasia. When we wouldn't give him details, he got aggressive." Sarah's hand tightened on the phone as she watched Shadow, who had taken up position near the front window. His posture was alert but calm, scanning the street with methodical attention. "Did he give a name?" "Said he was from some rescue organization, but the business card he left turned out to be fake. We filed an incident report, but—" Mark paused. "Dr. Martinez, there's something else. Going through Shadow's old files, I found a note I'd missed before. When they found him on Highway 23, he was wearing a heavy chain collar with some kind of electronic device attached. The police removed it before bringing him to us, logged it as evidence, but nothing ever came of the investigation." Sarah's veterinary mind immediately went to the implications. Underground fighting rings sometimes used modified shock collars to control their dogs. The thought made her physically ill, but it explained so much about Shadow's behavior, his specific triggers, his fear of certain sounds. "Mark, I need copies of everything. The incident report, the original police report, any security footage you have of the man who came asking questions. Something tells me these aren't coincidences." As she hung up, Sarah noticed Shadow had moved to her side, pressing gently against her leg. His eyes were fixed on her face, and she realized he had been responding to the tension in her voice. Somehow, in the space of just over 24 hours, this traumatized dog had begun to transition from protecting himself to protecting her. "We're okay," she assured him, carefully kneeling to his level. "No one's going to hurt you again." Shadow's response was unexpected. He leaned forward and briefly touched his nose to her cheek. The gesture was so gentle, so deliberate, that Sarah felt tears spring to her eyes. This wasn't just fear seeking comfort. This was comfort being offered. The moment was interrupted by a sharp knock at the front door. Shadow's body tensed, but instead of retreating in fear, he moved in front of Sarah, positioning himself between her and the potential threat. A low growl rumbled in his chest, not aggressive, but clearly protective. Sarah approached the door cautiously, Shadow moving with her like a shadow. Through the peephole, she saw 2 police officers standing on her porch, and her heart rate quickened. She hadn't expected them to respond to her report so quickly. "Dr. Martinez," the female officer called. "I'm Officer Chen. This is Officer Rodriguez. We're following up on your report about suspicious activity." Sarah opened the door, keeping Shadow behind her despite his clear desire to place himself in front. The officer's eyes immediately went to the German Shepherd, their postures shifting subtly, not reaching for weapons, but definitely more alert. "This is Shadow," Sarah explained quickly. "He's a recent rescue, very protective but not aggressive, or sought the shelter of his blanket. Instead, he stood firmly in the middle of the living room, his attention divided between the glass door and Sarah, as if he had appointed himself guardian of their shared space. In that moment, Sarah realized something profound. Shadow's trauma hadn't destroyed his capacity for courage, it had just buried it beneath layers of fear. Officer Chen nodded, her expression softening slightly as she noted Shadow's scarred appearance and watchful demeanor. "We actually have some information you might want to hear. May we come in?" The next few minutes were tense as they settled in the living room. Shadow never took his eyes off the officers, but he remained calm, taking his cues from Sarah's relaxed interaction with them. He positioned himself by her feet, close enough to act if needed, but not overtly threatening. "We ran the plates of a suspicious vehicle reported in this area early this morning," Officer Rodriguez began, glancing at his notes. "It comes back to a Michael Crane. Name mean anything to you?" Sarah shook her head, but she noticed Shadow's reaction immediately. At the sound of the name, his ears had flattened and a tremor ran through his body. The change was subtle but unmistakable. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. "Well, it means something to us," Officer Chen continued. "Crane's been under investigation for suspected involvement in an illegal dogfighting operation. 2 years ago, there was a major raid planned on his property just off Highway 23, but someone tipped him off. When police arrived, they found empty kennels and evidence that had been burned. The only thing missing was a German shepherd." Sarah finished quietly, her hand finding Shadow's fur. "That's when Shadow was found on the highway, wasn't it?" The officers exchanged glances. "The timing matches," Officer Rodriguez confirmed. "And the location is less than a mile from where your dog was picked up. The theory is that during the evacuation, one of their dogs either escaped or was abandoned. We never made the connection until now." Shadow pressed closer to Sarah as they talked, his body trembling slightly, but his protective stance never wavering. The pieces were falling into place. His specific fears, his reactions to certain sounds, the mysterious photographer, the man asking questions at the shelter. "We believe Crane's trying to rebuild his operation," Officer Chen said grimly. "And for some reason, he seems very interested in your dog. We'll increase patrols in the area. But Dr. Martinez, be careful. These people, they don't like loose ends." As the officers left, Sarah locked the door and turned to Shadow, seeing him in a new light. He wasn't just a traumatized shelter dog. He was a survivor, a witness, possibly even a key to bringing down the people who had hurt him and countless other animals. Shadow met her gaze steadily, and in his eyes, Sarah saw not just fear of the past, but determination for the future. Whatever came next, they would face it together. The veterinarian who had lost her heart dog, and the warrior who had found his courage again through love. The rest of the day passed in a blur of activity as Sarah put additional security measures in place. She called a local company to install security cameras, scheduled a contractor to reinforce the fence, and even contacted her neighbor, Mr. Peterson, a retired police officer, to keep an extra eye on the house. Shadow watched every phone call, every movement with intense focus. His behavior had shifted subtly since the police visit, as if the mention of his past had awakened something in him. The fearful shelter dog was still there. But now there were glimpses of something else, a noble guardian emerging from beneath the layers of trauma. "We need to document everything," Sarah explained to Shadow as she moved through the house, taking photos of his scars and distinctive markings. Her veterinary training told her these could be crucial evidence if it came to a legal case. Shadow stood patiently for each photo, somehow seeming to understand the importance of what she was doing. As evening approached, Sarah realized they had missed their afternoon meal in all the commotion. She headed to the kitchen to prepare dinner for both of them, Shadow following close behind. His shadow-like presence had become constant, but it didn't feel clingy or fearful anymore. It felt protective, purposeful. "You know," Sarah said as she measured out his food, "we're quite a pair, both trying to protect each other." She smiled, as Shadow's ears twitched at her words. "I guess that's what family does." The word family hung in the air between them, weighty with meaning. Shadow's tail gave that small wag again, becoming more frequent now, and he approached his bowl without his usual sideways caution. As he ate, Sarah noticed he kept one ear turned toward the windows, alert but not anxious. After dinner, Sarah settled on the couch with her laptop, researching everything she could find about Michael Crane and dogfighting operations in the area. Shadow lay at her feet, occasionally lifting his head to check the windows and doors, but otherwise relaxed, enough to rest. A small notification sound from her phone made them both jump. It was a message from Maya at the shelter. "Found security footage of the man asking about Shadow. Sending it now. Be careful, Dr. M." Sarah's hands shook slightly as she opened the video file. The grainy footage showed a tall man in a baseball cap speaking to the front desk volunteer. As the camera angle changed, Shadow suddenly stood up, a low growl rumbling in his chest. His eyes were fixed on the screen, recognition clear in his tense posture. "That's him, isn't it?" Sarah whispered, feeling sick. Even through the poor quality of the footage, she could see the man's aggressive gestures, the way the volunteer shrank back from him. "That's Crane." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Shadow's response was unmistakable. His growl deepened, and for the first time, Sarah saw a flash of something like anger in his eyes. Not fear, not anxiety, but righteous indignation. She quickly closed the video, not wanting to distress him further. "It's okay," she soothed, patting the couch beside her. She had been letting Shadow set the pace for physical proximity, never pushing for more than he was ready to give. To her surprise, he accepted the invitation, carefully climbing up next. To her, the weight of him on the couch, the warmth of his body next to hers, felt like a milestone in their journey. Sarah cautiously raised her hand, telegraphing her movement, and when Shadow didn't pull away, she gently stroked his head. "You're not alone anymore," she told him softly. "Whatever happens, we face it together." Shadow leaned into her touch, and Sarah felt a tear roll down her cheek as she realized this was the first time he had actively sought comfort from her. His body remained alert, his ears still tracking every sound from outside, but there was trust in the way he pressed against her side. As night fell, Sarah prepared for their second evening together, but with a different approach than the first. Instead of sleeping on the couch, she decided to try moving to her bedroom. Shadow needed to know the whole house was safe territory, not just the living room. "Come on, boy," she called softly, patting her leg. "Let's get some rest." Shadow followed her down the hallway, pausing briefly at the bedroom door. The room still held hints of Max's presence, his old bed in the corner, a few toys he'd hidden. Under the dresser, Sarah watched as Shadow processed these remnants of his predecessor, his nose working overtime to understand the story they told. To her amazement, Shadow walked directly to Max's bed, circled once, and lay down. It was such a normal, dog-like behavior that Sarah had to stifle a sob. He was choosing to sleep where another happy, loved dog had slept, as if accepting not just the space, but the possibility that he too deserved such happiness. Sarah climbed into her own bed, leaving the bedside lamp on low. Shadow's eyes gleamed in the dim light, alert but peaceful. Every few minutes his ears would swivel toward the window, maintaining his self-appointed guard duty, even as sleep began to tug at him. "Sweet dreams," Sarah whispered, and for the first time since leaving the shelter, Shadow's eyes closed fully, his breathing deep and regular. He had chosen to truly sleep, to truly trust, not because his fears were gone, but because he had found something worth being brave for. Outside, a light rain began to fall, washing away the day's tensions. But unlike the previous night, Shadow didn't startle at the sounds. Instead, he seemed to take comfort in them, as if the rain created a curtain of white noise that helped shield their sanctuary from the world's dangers. Sarah watched him sleep, marveling at how much had changed in just 2 days. They had begun as two wounded souls, one grieving, one traumatized, and somehow found in each other the strength to heal, to trust, to protect. Whatever threats tomorrow might bring, tonight they were safe, together, home. The sound of breaking glass shattered the pre-dawn quiet. Shadow was on his feet before Sarah fully awakened, his hackles raised, but his growl controlled and purposeful. She reached for her phone, heart pounding, as heavy footsteps echoed from the direction of the kitchen. "Shadow, quiet," she whispered, already dialing 911. The German Shepherd immediately stopped growling but remained rigid with attention, his ears forward, his body positioned between Sarah and the bedroom door. The dispatcher's voice seemed impossibly loud in the darkness. 911, what's your emergency? This is Dr. Sarah Martinez at 1542 Oak Grove Road, Sarah whispered, her veterinary training helping her maintain composure. Someone's broken into my home. Police have an active case file, possible connection to Michael Crane. The mention of Crane's name sparked immediate response. Officers are en route, Dr. Martinez. Find a secure location and... A floorboard creaked in the hallway. Shadow's reaction was immediate but measured. He moved to the bedroom doorway, his body language transforming from alert to commanding. Gone was any trace of the fearful shelter dog. In his place stood a warrior who had found something worth fighting for. Sarah's hand found her pepper spray in the bedside drawer, her other hand still gripping the phone. The hallway light suddenly flicked on, and a shadow appeared under the bedroom door. What happened next seemed to unfold in slow motion. The door began to open, and Shadow, her gentle, traumatized shadow, launched into action with a precision that spoke of professional training. He didn't attack wildly. Instead, he charged with focused intent, his substantial weight hitting the door just as it started to open. There was a crash and a startled cry as the intruder was knocked backward. Shadow's bark now filled the house, not the fearful sound Sarah had heard at the shelter, but a deep, authoritative warning that seemed to shake the walls. "Police! Drop it!" The shout came from outside, followed by the sound of breaking wood as officers forced their way through the back door. Flashlight beams cut through the darkness, and Shadow immediately adjusted his position, maintaining his protective stance while clearly allowing the police to do their job. Within moments, the intruder was in custody, a young man Sarah didn't recognize, but whose identity was quickly established through the fake animal control ID in his pocket. He had been sent to scout the house to assess how difficult it would be to get to Shadow. As the officers led the man away, Sarah noticed something remarkable. Shadow, while still alert and watchful, showed no fear of the police. It was as if he recognized them as allies, understanding on some level that they were there to help. Officer Chen, who had responded personally to the call, crouched down to Shadow's level. "Good boy," she said softly, noting how he maintained his protective position near Sarah while remaining calm. "You've got quite a guardian here, Dr. Martinez." Sarah could only nod, her throat tight with emotion. In the face of real danger, Shadow hadn't retreated into his trauma. Instead, he had risen above it, choosing courage over fear, protection over self-preservation. The next few hours were a blur of police statements, crime scene photos and security assessments. Through it all, Shadow remained a steady presence at Sarah's side, occasionally touching his nose to her hand, as if to reassure her that he was still on guard. As dawn broke, casting long shadows across the kitchen floor, now scattered with broken glass, Sarah finally had a moment to process what had happened. She sat at her kitchen table, a cup of untouched coffee growing cold before her, and watched as Shadow methodically checked every window and door before returning to her side. "You saved me," she whispered, reaching out to stroke his fur. Shadow leaned into her touch and she felt his body trembling slightly, not with fear, but with the after-effects of adrenaline. "You chose to fight instead of hide." Shadow's eyes met hers, and in them she saw something that brought fresh tears to her eyes, a fierce, unwavering loyalty. In just 3 days, this dog who had been deemed too traumatized to save had not only begun to heal, but had found the strength to protect the person who had given him a chance. Officer Chen returned with an update that made Sarah's blood run cold. The intruder had confessed Crane hadn't just sent him to scout the house. He had been meant to take photos, to prove that Shadow was there, so they could plan something bigger. "We're putting a patrol car outside," Chen said firmly. "And, Dr. Martinez, consider getting Shadow certified as a protection dog. With his training background and what we saw tonight, he could be a legitimate deterrent to anyone thinking of coming back." As the morning light grew stronger, Sarah looked at Shadow with new understanding. He wasn't just a victim to be healed. He was a survivor with skills and strength that had been twisted by cruelty but could now be redirected toward protection and love. Shadow met her gaze steadily, his posture relaxed but vigilant. The fearful dog from the shelter was still there, evidenced by the slight tremor that occasionally ran through him. But now that fear was overshadowed by something stronger, a determined spirit that refused to let the shadows of his past prevent him from protecting his new future. The manila envelope arrived 3 days after the break-in attempt, its official Department of Defense seal gleaming under Sarah's kitchen light. Shadow sat nearby, his posture alert but calm, watching as she carefully opened the package with hands that trembled slightly. Inside, a single photograph caught her breath. It showed a younger Shadow, or a dog remarkably similar to him, wearing a specialized military harness, standing beside a soldier in desert camouflage. The dog's posture was different from the traumatized shelter animal she knew, precise, powerful, focused. "Military Working Dog Program Special Operations K9 Unit," read the accompanying letter, signed by Colonel Richard Hawthorne. "Classified. File pertaining to MWD 742, German Shepherd, classified training level Omega 9. Sarah looked up at Shadow, who met her gaze with an intensity that now made perfect sense. The shelter's evaluations had always noted his extraordinary intelligence, his precise movements, his ability to process complex situations. Traits they had attributed to trauma, but which now revealed a far deeper story. Colonel Hawthorne's letter explained the impossible. Shadow, or MWD 742, as he was known in military records, had been part of an elite Special Operations K9 unit trained for high-risk reconnaissance and protective missions. His training went far beyond standard military dog protocols, involving psychological conditioning that allowed him to operate in extreme environments with minimal human direction. The most shocking revelation came in the third paragraph. MWD 742 was our primary asset in Operation Nighthawk, a classified mission targeting underground criminal networks specializing in illegal animal trafficking and fighting rings. Suddenly, Michael Crane's obsessive pursuit made horrifying sense. Shadow wasn't just a random dog who had escaped a fighting operation. He was a key witness and potentially the most dangerous threat to a criminal network that spanned multiple states. "They want him back," Sarah whispered, her hand finding Shadow's fur. He leaned into her touch, but his eyes remained watchful, scanning the room with the same precision the letter described. The military's letter was both a request and a warning. They needed Shadow's testimony, or more accurately, his ability, to identify key operatives through scent and behavioral recognition, but they also warned of significant danger. Crane's network had connections that reached deep into law enforcement and military circles. Colonel Hawthorne requested a meeting, providing a secure contact number. His final paragraph was telling, MWD 742 was our most advanced psychological operations asset. His ability to read human behavior and navigate complex threat environments was unprecedented. But the psychological cost was significant. Sarah understood now why Shadow's shelter file had been so contradictory. The gentle dog, who seemed unable to trust, was actually a highly trained operative whose psychological conditioning had been systematically broken, likely as part of Crane's attempt to neutralize his potential threat. When the military's representative arrived 2 days later, Shadow's response was nothing short of remarkable. A tall, lean man in civilian clothes who introduced himself as Captain Michael Rodriguez approached the house. Before he could knock, Shadow was at the window, his body language shifting from protective to something more complex, a professional acknowledgement. He recognizes the protocol, Captain Rodriguez said quietly to Sarah. Even after everything, some part of his training remains intact. The meeting that followed was a delicate dance of revelation. Shadow moved with a precision that contrasted sharply with his shelter behavior, sitting at exact angles, tracking conversations with laser-focused attention. He was no longer just a rescue dog, but a living piece of classified history. Sarah watched, her veterinary training and protective instincts warring with each new revelation. These were not just people seeking information. They were attempting to reclaim a living weapon. Her hand found Shadow's collar, a deliberate gesture of protection. "He's not a file or an asset," she said firmly when Captain Rodriguez began, discussing potential military debriefing. "He's a living being who has been through enough." Shadow's response was subtle but powerful. He shifted his body slightly, positioning himself between Sarah and the captain, a protective stance that spoke volumes about his true nature. Not a broken dog, not a military asset, but a sentient being who had chosen his allegiance. As the afternoon light cast long shadows across the living room, Sarah realized they were at a crossroads. Shadow's past was far more complex than a simple rescue story. He was a survivor, a witness, and potentially the key to dismantling a dangerous criminal network. And now they would face whatever came next, together. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The first signs were subtle. A slight disturbance in the gravel along the fence line, a barely perceptible depression in the soft earth where the wooden panels met the ground. Sarah might have missed it entirely, but Shadow's focused investigation told a different story. Sergeant Elena Torres arrived precisely at 900, her military bearing evident in every measured step. She moved with the quiet confidence of someone who had spent years in high-stakes environments, her steel-grey eyes taking in every detail of Sarah's property with professional precision. MWD 742 was our most advanced psychological operations. A canine, Torres explained, her voice clinical yet tinged with something deeper, respect, perhaps even affection. His threat assessment protocols were developed over 3 years of intensive training. Most people see a dog. We saw a living intelligence system. Shadow sat beside Sarah, his posture transforming subtly as Torres spoke. Gone was the hesitant, sheltered dog. In his place emerged a creature of calculated awareness. His ears, which had once been pinned back in fear, now moved with deliberate precision, tracking sounds, processing information with a sophistication that defied typical canine behavior. "Show me," Torres said quietly, dropping a series of objects onto the living room floor. A set of keys, a smartphone, a leather wallet, a small electronic device. To the untrained eye, they were random items. To Shadow, they were a complex puzzle of potential threats. Sarah watched in astonishment as Shadow began a systematic assessment. He didn't approach the items directly. Instead, he circled them, his nose working in precise, controlled movements. Each object received a calculated investigation, sniffing for explosives, electronic signatures, trace chemical compounds. His training went beyond standard explosive or narcotics detection, Torres explained. MWD 742 was trained to identify human behavioral markers to predict potential threat vectors before they materialized. When Shadow returned to Sarah's side, he placed himself in a specific position, body angled to provide maximum protection, one paw slightly forward, ready to move instantly. It was a stance so precise it could have been drawn with a protractor. The conversation shifted to the fence line. Torres confirmed what Sarah had begun to suspect: they were being watched. The slight disturbance Shadow had investigated was more than just casual surveillance. It was a professional reconnaissance, someone measuring approaches, testing security protocols. "Crane is escalating," Torres said grimly. He knows what Shadow represents, a living piece of evidence that could dismantle his entire operation. Sarah's hand found Shadow's fur, a gesture of protection that seemed to resonate with the dog's own protective instincts. The bond between them had transformed from rescue to partnership. Shadow was no longer just a dog she had saved. He was a complex ally with capabilities far beyond what anyone had initially understood. As if to demonstrate this point, Shadow suddenly went completely still. His entire body became a living sensor, ears focused on a sound too distant for human ears. A moment later, the security system's exterior camera picked up a vehicle slowly passing the house, moving too slowly to be casual traffic. He just identified a potential threat before our technology could, Torres observed, a note of professional admiration in her voice. The day's revelations were more than just a reconnection to Shadow's past. They were an unveiling of a sophisticated intelligence that had been buried beneath layers of trauma. Each moment peeled back another layer, revealing not a broken animal, but a highly trained operative who had survived attempts to destroy his core capabilities. As evening approached, Sarah watched Shadow conduct his methodical property assessment. He moved with a precision that spoke of years of intensive training, checking approach vectors, identifying potential observation points, creating a living security perimeter. "He's reclaiming himself," Sarah whispered to Torres, "not as a weapon, but as who he was always meant to be." Shadow paused in his patrol, turning to meet Sarah's eyes. In that moment, the connection between them was unmistakable. Two survivors, finding strength in each other's protection. The threat from Crane was growing, but for the first time, Shadow wasn't running from his past. He was preparing to confront it, with Sarah by his side. The morning began with calculated precision. Sarah watched as Shadow conducted his now familiar routine, a methodical security assessment that blended seamlessly with their daily life. What had once been survival mechanisms had transformed into a sophisticated protection protocol. At 6:30, before the neighborhood stirred, Shadow completed his perimeter check. His movements were no longer those of a traumatized shelter dog, but of a highly trained operative reasserting control over his environment. Each step was deliberate, each scan of the yard a professional reconnaissance. Sergeant Torres's previous visit had revealed the depth of Shadow's capabilities. Now those capabilities were being strategically deployed. Sarah had consulted with both Torres and local law enforcement, and a plan was taking shape. A carefully constructed sting operation, designed to draw out Crane's network. "He's not just a dog anymore," Captain Rodriguez had explained during their last strategy meeting. "He's a living intelligence asset with capabilities most human operatives would envy." The plan hinged on Shadow's extraordinary sensory and behavioral assessment skills. They would create a controlled scenario that would force Crane's surveillance team to reveal themselves, using Shadow's military-grade threat detection as the primary reconnaissance tool. Sarah's veterinary clinic would play a crucial role. She would continue her normal routine, with Shadow accompanying her, a seemingly routine transition that would mask their true intentions. The clinic's location, its predictable patient flow, and its proximity to several key transportation routes made it the perfect staging ground. At precisely 0800, Sarah's SUV pulled into the clinic's parking lot. Shadow's positioning was immediate and professional, not just sitting beside her, but strategically placed to provide maximum protective coverage. His head would turn at specific intervals, tracking potential approach vectors with a precision that defied typical canine behavior. What appeared to be routine became a complex dance of strategic positioning. Shadow wasn't just accompanying Sarah, he was actively managing the clinic's security landscape. His threat assessment protocols, honed through years of military training, transformed the medical facility into a controlled environment. Patients noticed something different about the German Shepherd. Where most clinic dogs might seek attention, Shadow maintained a professional distance. His interactions were calculated. A brief touch to comfort a nervous child, a specific positioning that allowed him to monitor both Sarah and the clinic's entrance. By midday, the first signs of their strategy's effectiveness emerged. A vehicle, nondescript, carefully chosen to blend into suburban traffic, made multiple passes by the clinic. Shadow's response was immediate but controlled. No barking, no overt aggression. Instead, a subtle shift in posture, a specific ear movement that Sarah now recognized as his threat-identified signal. "We're being watched," Sarah whispered, her hand finding Shadow's collar, not to restrain, but to communicate. Their partnership had evolved into something beyond human and animal. They were two professionals working a complex operational scenario. The gathering storm outside seemed symbolic. Dark clouds built on the horizon, promising a significant weather event. But the real storm was the one they were carefully constructing. A strategic trap designed to expose Crane's surveillance network. Shadow's transformation was complete. No longer the broken shelter dog, no longer just a rescue. He had become a living testament to resilience, intelligence, and purpose. Each moment was a deliberate choice, each movement a calculated decision. As the afternoon light began to fade, casting long shadows across the clinic's waiting room, Sarah understood the true depth of their journey. Shadow wasn't just recovering from his past, he was reclaiming his entire identity, piece by calculated piece. The storm was coming, and they would be ready. The tactical briefing occupied Sarah's living room, transforming the space into a strategic command center. Captain Rodriguez, Sergeant Torres, and 2 additional federal agents reviewed the operation's final details, their attention consistently drawn to Shadow, the mission's most critical asset. Shadow sat precisely 3 feet from Sarah, his positioning, a calculated protective measure. His military training had fully resurfaced, manifesting in a hyper-awareness that transformed him from a rescue dog to a sophisticated operational tool. Each movement was deliberate, each scan of the room a testament to his advanced training. "We've identified 3 potential approach vectors for Crane's surveillance team," Rodriguez explained, spreading a detailed map of the city across the coffee table. Shadow's eyes tracked the movement, his ears rotating to capture every nuance of conversation. The storm outside mirrored their internal tension. Thunder rumbled in the distance, a low growl that seemed to echo Shadow's own, barely contained energy. Electrical charges built in the atmosphere, promising an imminent release, much like the confrontation they were carefully orchestrating. Sarah's role was critical. As a local veterinarian with deep community connections, she provided the perfect cover. Shadow would be her seemingly ordinary companion, his extraordinary capabilities hidden beneath a veneer of normalcy. Their partnership had evolved beyond handler and asset. They were now a unified operational unit. Torres demonstrated Shadow's counter-surveillance capabilities with a series of precise commands. He could identify electronic surveillance devices, track multiple human targets simultaneously, and assess threat levels with a precision that defied conventional canine abilities. What had once been trauma had transformed into a hyper-focused survival mechanism. "He's not just detecting threats," Torres explained. "He's predicting potential scenarios, mapping out contingencies faster than most human operatives." The federal team had spent weeks building a complex trap. Crane's network would be lured into believing they had the upper hand, unaware that Shadow was the true architect of their potential downfall. Every movement was calculated, every interaction a carefully constructed narrative. As night fell, the storm intensified. Lightning illuminated the room in stark, brief moments, casting Shadow's profile in sharp relief. He was no longer the broken shelter dog. He was a warrior, reclaiming his purpose, his identity forged through survival and unexpected partnership. Sarah's hand found Shadow's fur, a gesture of connection, of mutual protection. They were more than rescuer and rescued. They were partners, bound by a journey that had transformed them both. The confrontation was coming, and they would face it together. The operation unfolded with military precision at 0:30, the darkest hour before dawn. Shadow stood beside Sarah in the clinic's parking lot, every muscle coiled with a purpose that transcended his previous existence as a traumatized shelter dog. Federal agents had meticulously mapped out their strategy. Crane's network believed they were closing in on their target, unaware that they were walking into a carefully constructed trap. Shadow was the linchpin, a living intelligence asset, whose capabilities far exceeded conventional expectations. As the first vehicle approached, Shadow's transformation became definitively clear. Where once he would have retreated, cowering from potential threats, he now stood firm. His positioning was calculated, not just protective, but strategically offensive. Each movement reflected years of specialized training, now fully reclaimed from the depths of his trauma. The first confrontation came swiftly. Two individuals attempted to approach the clinic's rear entrance, their movements suggesting professional training. Shadow's response was instantaneous. A low, controlled vocalization, not a bark, but a sound of pure warning, stopped them in their tracks. His body language communicated what words could not. This was not a victim, but a highly trained operative ready to neutralize any threat. Captain Rodriguez, positioned strategically nearby, gave a nearly imperceptible nod. Shadow had just demonstrated why he was considered the most advanced psychological operations canine in military history. His ability to assess and communicate threat levels was beyond standard protocol. As the operation progressed, the storm that had been building for days began to break. Lightning illuminated the parking lot in stark, brief moments, revealing the carefully positioned federal agents. The rain washed away the last vestiges of Shadow's past, each droplet seeming to cleanse the trauma that had once defined him. Sarah watched in awe as Shadow moved with a precision that defied his previous shelter existence. He was no longer the dog who had spent 847 days waiting to be saved. He was a protector, a witness, a living testament to survival and purpose. Crane's primary operative made a critical mistake. Believing they had the advantage, he moved to approach Sarah directly. Shadow's response was immediate and professional. In the move that would later be studied in operational training manuals, he positioned himself between the threat and Sarah, his body a living shield that communicated absolute protection. The confrontation lasted less than 7 minutes. When federal agents moved in to make arrests, Shadow remained perfectly positioned, not aggressive but prepared. His eyes tracked every movement, his body a controlled mechanism of protection and intelligence. As dawn broke, the storm began to clear. Sunlight cut through the dissipating clouds, casting long shadows across the parking lot. It was a visual metaphor for Shadow's journey, the darkness of his past giving way to a new, purposeful existence. Sarah knelt beside him, her hand finding his fur in a gesture that had become their language of mutual protection. "You did it," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "You took back your story. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story." Shadow's response was subtle but profound. For the first time since his rescue, he leaned into her touch completely. No hesitation, no fear. He was home, not just in a physical sense, but in every way that mattered. The storm had passed, and with it, the last remnants of Shadow's broken past. The Department of Defense ceremony was unlike any official event Sarah had attended. Sunlight streamed through the wide windows of the military base conference room, symbolizing the new beginnings that spring had brought. Shadow stood proudly beside her, his posture no longer a reflection of past trauma, but of quiet confidence and purpose. Colonel Hawthorne presented Shadow with the K9 Distinguished Service Medal, an honor rarely bestowed on military working dogs. MWD 742, he announced, using Shadow's military designation, has not only been instrumental in dismantling a significant criminal network, but has become a beacon of hope for rehabilitation and recovery. The medal ceremony was more than a personal recognition. It had become a pivotal moment for understanding canine trauma and resilience. Representatives from animal rescue organizations, veterinary researchers, and military personnel listened intently as Shadow's journey was detailed. From a dog deemed unadoptable to a critical operative who had helped bring down a sophisticated criminal enterprise. What followed was even more remarkable. Sarah had worked with Sergeant Torres to develop a specialized rehabilitation program for traumatized service and rescue dogs, using Shadow's recovery as a primary case study. The program, nicknamed Shadow's Path, would provide comprehensive psychological and physical rehabilitation for dogs with complex trauma histories. At the Mountain View Animal Shelter, Shadow had become something of a legend. Maya, his former kennel attendant, now ran a specialized training program for dogs with challenging backgrounds. She often brought in dogs who reminded her of Shadow, those deemed too damaged, too fearful to be rehabilitated. "He changed everything," Maya told Sarah during a recent visit. "We used to see these dogs as problems to be managed. Now we see them as survivors waiting to be understood." Shadow's transformation extended beyond professional recognition. At home, he had become the dog Sarah had always hoped he would be. His mornings began with playful interactions, something unimaginable during his first days of rescue. He would bring her tennis balls, engage in gentle play, and most importantly, he had learned to truly relax. The nightmares had largely subsided. When they did come, they were briefer, less intense. Sarah would speak softly, her hand on his fur, and Shadow would settle quickly, a far cry from the terrified dog who had first arrived in her home. His relationship with local veterinary and military communities had become something of a phenomenon. Sarah's clinic now hosted monthly workshops on animal rehabilitation, with Shadow often present as a living testament to recovery. Children and adults alike were drawn to his story, a narrative of hope that transcended species. As spring progressed, Shadow's world continued to expand. He accompanied Sarah on community outreach programs, his calm presence helping other rescue dogs learn to trust again. His psychological assessment skills, once used in military operations, now served a healing purpose. The federal investigation into Crane's network had been comprehensive. Shadow's precise documentation and sensory evidence had been crucial in securing multiple convictions. More importantly, the operation had exposed a network that had harmed countless animals, a victory that went far beyond personal redemption. During a follow-up meeting with Captain Rodriguez, Sarah learned the full extent of their impact. "We've identified and shut down 3 additional criminal networks," he explained. "Shadow's work has saved hundreds of animals from similar fates." As evening approached, Sarah watched Shadow in the backyard. He was no longer the dog who had been afraid to step outside. Now he explored with curiosity, rolled in the grass, watched the birds with a calm alertness that spoke of complete healing. The maple tree, where Max's old rope swing hung now, had a new swing, one that Shadow occasionally played with, a symbol of continued joy and recovery. His tail wagged freely, a sound of soft pants mixing with the spring evening's gentle breeze. Shadow was home, truly, completely home. The Mountain View Animal Shelter looked different from the last time Shadow had been there. Where once there were rows of metal cages and clinical concrete, now stood a state-of-the-art rehabilitation center. The transformation was more than physical. It was philosophical. Sarah walked beside Shadow, their partnership now a seamless blend of professional collaboration and deep personal connection. They had returned not as visitors, but as catalysts of change. Shadow's journey had become the blueprint for a revolutionary approach to animal rescue and rehabilitation. Mark, the shelter's director, greeted them at the entrance. The man who had once prepared to euthanize Shadow now stood as a testament to the power of second chances. "Welcome home," he said, his voice thick with emotion. The new facility bore Shadow's name, the Shadow Martinez Rehabilitation Center. It was more than a memorial. It was a living, breathing testament to the possibility of recovery. Where once dogs were assessed solely on their immediate behavior, now they were understood through a lens of trauma, potential, and hope. Shadow moved through the facility with a calm confidence that belied his traumatic past. His role had evolved from a rescued dog to a professional rehabilitation assistant. Traumatized dogs who might have been deemed unadoptable now found hope in his presence, a living example of complete recovery. In the specialized training room, Shadow demonstrated his unique skills. A young German shepherd, similar to his past self, cowered in the corner. Where once this would have triggered memories of his own trauma, Shadow now approached with calculated gentleness. His body language communicated safety, his movements deliberate and reassuring. Maya, now the center's lead behavioral specialist, explained their new approach. "We used to see these dogs as problems," she told a group of visiting veterinarians and animal behaviorists. "Now we see them as survivors, waiting to be understood." The center had become a beacon of hope, drawing experts from around the country. Shadow's medical and psychological records, once classified military documents, were now part of groundbreaking research on animal trauma and rehabilitation. Outside, the shelter's yard had been transformed. Where concrete once dominated, now there were carefully designed rehabilitation spaces, areas for gradual exposure, safe zones for traumatized animals, spaces that understood the complex journey of recovery. As the afternoon light filtered through the facility's large windows, Shadow sat beside Sarah, watching a group of formerly traumatized dogs play together. His journey had become more than a personal story of recovery. It was a movement, a new understanding of what was possible. Mark approached, holding a framed photograph. It was Shadow's original shelter intake. 40 years had transformed both Shadow and the world around him. What began as a single rescue had become a comprehensive movement in animal rehabilitation, with Shadow at its epicenter. The Shadow Martinez Foundation now operated rehabilitation centers across the country, each facility a testament to the power of understanding, patience, and unconditional support. Sarah watched from the observation room as Shadow worked with a new group of traumatized rescue dogs. His approach was nothing short of miraculous, a blend of professional training and profound empathy. Where once he had been defined by his own trauma, he now guided others through theirs with a gentle, knowing presence. The Foundation's approach had revolutionized animal rescue. No longer were dogs categorized simply as adoptable or unadoptable. Instead, each animal was viewed as an individual with a unique story, potential, and capacity for healing. Shadow had become the living embodiment of this philosophy, proof that recovery was possible, that trauma need not define a life's entire narrative. Military and veterinary professionals from around the world studied Shadow's rehabilitation process. His journey had become more than a personal story. It was a comprehensive case study in psychological recovery, transcending species boundaries. Research published in leading veterinary journals traced his transformation, offering hope to countless animals and their human companions. At home, the bond between Sarah and Shadow remained as strong as ever. Their relationship had long since moved beyond rescue and rehabilitation. They were partners, companions, a team that had survived and thrived through the most challenging of circumstances. Each morning began with a ritual. Shadow bringing Sarah her morning coffee, a small act that spoke volumes about their connection. The maple tree in the backyard, where Max's old rope swing had once hung, now supported a memorial that celebrated both dogs. Nearby, a garden flourished, planted by Sarah, maintained by Shadow's careful attention. It was a living metaphor for their journey, something beautiful growing from ground that had once known only pain. During speaking engagements, Sarah would often share Shadow's full story. From his 847 days in the shelter to his military service, from his rescue to his current role as a rehabilitation specialist, his journey captured the imagination of audiences worldwide. But more importantly, it offered a message of hope that healing is possible, that trauma can be transformed, that every being deserves a chance to become who they were meant to be. Shadow's impact extended far beyond individual dogs. The Foundation had helped reshape policies around animal welfare, pushing for more comprehensive approaches to rescue, rehabilitation, and protection. Laws had been changed, awareness had been raised, and the conversation around traumatized animals had been fundamentally altered. As evening approached, Sarah and Shadow took their customary walk. His movements were still precise, a remnant of his military training, but now infused with a joy that had been absent for so long. The German shepherd, who had once been too afraid to leave his kennel, now explored the world with curiosity and confidence. Their journey had come full circle. Shadow was no longer defined by what had happened to him, but by what he had chosen to become: a protector, a healer, a beacon of hope. In the soft light of sunset, Sarah looked at Shadow, no longer seeing a rescue dog, a military asset, or a victim, but simply seeing her companion, her friend, her family. "We did it," she whispered, her hand finding his fur in that familiar gesture of connection. Shadow's response was a gentle lean against her leg, a wag of his tail. A simple act that spoke of everything they had survived, everything they had become. Their story was not just about recovery. It was about transformation, about the extraordinary capacity to heal, to love, to begin again. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.